wanted to give you just a brief introduction and a little bit of context for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This photograph on this slide is of a place called Lud's Church in Staffordshire. Simon Armitage, who's the translator of the particular version of the poem that we have in our textbook, says this is a natural fissure in the rocks near the village of Flash in Derbyshire. Now, those who propose it as the site of the Green Chapel certainly have picked out a place that looks eerie enough to have inspired the poet. And of course, one of the nice things and lovely things about mythology and romance is that we're always looking for some roots of the truth. So we have people who have looked for the site of Troy to know where the Trojan War, because we always assume that there is at least some thread of reality that works its way into these stories. And the particular lines that Armitage thinks that those who cite this as a possible location are relying on are these. He had had a hole on the end and on another side, and overgrown with grass and glades everywhere, and all was hollow within, nothing but an old cave or a crevice of an old crag. In translating the poem, Armitage tries to explain his particular approach. And one of the things that you might wonder about is when we come to the section of the Canterbury Tales we're going to read it in Middle English. We will read what we read of the Fairy Queen in Middle English. But he says that there are particular issues that general readers might encounter in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And he says to the trained medievalist, the poem is readable in its original form. Well, I think I told you at the beginning, I'm not a medievalist, I'm a generalist. And even if you do a PhD, you might not specialize in this particular period of English literature. And he says, even for the non-specialist, certain lines, such as, "But Arthur would not eat till all were served," are perfectly comprehensible. We have no issue at all understanding those lines. However, he goes on to say that there are lines that are completely incomprehensible to us without special training. And he says, to an untrained eye, it is as if the poem is lying beneath a thin coat of ice. To someone interested in narrative and form, the urge to blow a little warm breath across the layer of frosting eventually proved irresistible. And he says this is particularly irresistible for him because he is a northerner who not only recognizes plenty of the poem's dialect, but who also detects an echo of his own speech within the original. And how many of these do you recognize? For example, words such as bide, which means to wait, and of course we are all familiar with to abide, to wait for, even in silly things like the dude abides. No but, which becomes a kind of contraction like cannot, for nothing but. Childer for children, leke for play. I'm not familiar with that one, but carp. Do you ever hear people talk about others who just keep carping on about something? And that, of course, was the word for talk. And I remember hearing that word for the first time and thinking, what does that have to do with a fish? But it's an old word that has stayed in our language. The contraction bout for without, brid for bird. I also wasn't familiar with Sam for gather up. And barley sounds really close to parlay, which we're familiar with when we talk about people who get together to trade and try to create a truce. And he says they're still in usage in the Midlands of England, though mainly and sadly he says that many of these words are gone from the older generation. I know that when we looked at the word hit on the former slide, that my mother's kin in Appalachia used that word. That's how they pronounced it, as if it still had an H on it. And I don't know if that's completely died out now, or if some of you still run across that dialect among people if you do come from Eastern Kentucky or Eastern the mountains of Appalachia. And this little article that I'm taking this information from is available to you if you want to look at the whole thing. And there's the website of the British Library where I took it. So one thing when we think about translation is that translation itself is an art form. And translating involves choices. Oftentimes it's difficult to find the literal word to replace another word, but sometimes if you do insist on being absolutely literal, you'll end up having to lose the sense of the poem and the readability of the poem and destroy its beauty. So Armitage points out that over the years there have been dozens, possibly hundreds of translations of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I read a little story to my children called Sir Gawain and the Loathly Lady when they were young. And these range from important scholarly restorations where perhaps a page has been damaged and there needs to be an emendation, to free-handed poetic or prose versions, which might actually be more rightly termed adaptations than translations. Some translators, he says, for perfectly valid reasons and with great success, have chosen not to imitate Sir Gawain's highly alliterative form. And it's really dangerous to do that. With Dante, for example, scholars who read Latin will say that English just doesn't have as much rhyme in it as Italian does. And so if you try to keep the rhyme exactly as Dante did, you end up with something that sounds really sing-songy, and it's just really, really hard to do without imposing itself upon the poem so that you forget the sense of the poem and start thinking about these sing-songy words. Armitage had this particular problem, translation problem, to solve. But he says to him, alliteration is the warp and weft of the poem, without which it is just so many fine threads. In some very elemental way, the story and the sense of the poem is directly located within its sound. The percussive patterning of the words serves to reinforce their meaning and to countersink them within the memory. Now, he himself, of course, you can tell, has caught the poem in a way, and so he is using alliteration like warp and weft and percussive patterning. And I just want to point out, and if you want to read with me, this is in Fit 2, and it's on page 153. And I don't want you to think too much about it. I just want you to hear this. This is some of the most beautiful description of the changing of season that I have ever read in my entire life. And I want to start it at about line 500, because of course one of the things that the poet does on this page is that he foreshadows that Sir Gawain has had this challenge and he's got to wait a whole year. Now, can you imagine how horrible it would be to wait for a whole year knowing that a confrontation with this creature who is not only this huge beastly man, but so supernatural that he can carry his own head in his hand after you have severed it with an axe. So start about 500 and let's just listen. I just want you to hear the alliteration. And the little, and we'll talk about this on a slide, an upcoming slide, but the little bob and wheel, where we have this little rhymed verse at the end of it. So the festival finishes and a new year follows in eternal sequence, season by season. And lavish Christmas after lavish Christmas come the lean days of Lent, when the flesh is tested with fish and simple food. Then the world's weather wages war on winter. Cold shrinks earthwards and the clouds climb. Sun warmed, shimmering rain comes showering onto meadows and fields where flowers unfurl. Woods and grounds wear a wardrobe of green. Birds burble with life and build busily as summer spreads, settling on slopes as it should. Now every hedgerow brims with blossom and bud, and lovely songbirds sing from leafy, leafy woods. Now you can hear how there is a percussion that goes along with this kind of alliteration. It is not rhyme that makes that cadence. It is both the meter of the poem, but the percussive patterning of the words, as he says. The particular alliterative technique that defines Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is called the bob and wheel. A bob and wheel is defined as lines of unrhymed alliterative verse that culminate in a slightly longer line. The longer line's last word is called the bob. This bob spins the wheel, which is a rhymed stanza, usually rhyming A, B, A, B. Let's look at this image from your textbook. We see these long lines of alliterative verse. Staff came quickly and served him in style, with several soups all seasoned to taste, double helpings as was fitting, and a feast of fish, some baked in bread, some browned over flames, some boiled or steamed, some stewed in spices, and subtle sauces which the knight savored. 4 or 5 times he called it a feast, and the courteous company happily cheered him along. On penance plates you dine, there's better board to come. The warming heady wine then freed his mind for fun. Now, if we think about the content in those lines, poor fellow, here he is in the midst of Lent. Christmas is over, and we know, of course, that Catholics and other liturgical denominations think of Lent as a time of penance, of remembering that we are dust and ashes. And one of the ways in which this is signified is by giving up meat and eating fish instead. Well, poor Gawain, I mean, all of his friends, the other knights, feel really sorry for him. And even though he's eating fish, 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 there's been an attempt to make his life as good as it can be because, you know, he may not be back next year to eat anything. And, you know, he's kind of grateful for that. He's like 4 or 5 times, it's like, my word, this is some really good fish. But the company says, you know, they're trying to encourage him. He'll be around for feasts. He'll be around for real feasts, even though he's dining on penance plates. And then, bless him, he drinks a little wine and he tries to forget what he's going to face along the way. And that's the bob and the wheel. And if you look at all of those pages, you can see it over and over throughout the entire poem. Now, I love this poem too because it begins at Christmastide, and I love Christmas. And of course, Christmastide is a time of feast. So the passage on the last slide focuses not just on providing the scene, but the passages at the beginning of the poem focus on the lavish array of food in Arthur's court. And it's not only the display of food, there are double helpings of everything, for example, but on entertainment. And we learn at the beginning of the poem that the feast has gone on every night of Christmastide, beginning with the birth of Christ and continuing through the new year. Well, not only then was the food at the dinners served sumptuous, but the days were filled with hunting and jousting and knightly sports. The evenings were filled with entertainment from musicians and flirting and dancing. The Noel gifts were kind of a double entendre because the men were trying to steal kisses and they were asking for favors, perhaps just a glance from the ladies. Now, why 12 days? You may already know this because you may be Catholic or you may celebrate Christmas in this way. I grew up pretty much that you put the tree up at Thanksgiving and you take it down the day after Christmas. But in the Catholic liturgical tradition, Christmas Day is really the first day when you're supposed to start celebrating, and it runs through the 6th of January. The 6th of January is the Feast of the Epiphany, and it's a liturgical holiday that celebrates the recognition of the Christ child by the wise men from the East. Now, this celebration in Sir Gawain and the Green Knights has gone on even a little bit more because, of course, they can feast really up until Ash Wednesday, which is the first day of Lent. And Arthur maybe is a little bored by that time, although the poet seems to think that everybody is still having a really good time. And he is this hall of the king, this palace is still filled with the riches and beneficence of this magnificent king and his magnificent court. But at any rate, Arthur this night will not dine not only until all the others have been served, but he wants something different, something special. He wants a story, or he wants a game that will put one of his knights to a test. Now, some lovely but probably romantic speculation says that the gifts the lovers gave each other on the 12 days of Christmas in the song that we sing are actually coded references to Catholic doctrine. Catholicism was driven underground a couple of hundred years after this poem. During Henry VIII's dissolution of the Catholic Church in England, when he established himself not only as just the secular head, but the religious head of the Church of England. So what followed that were priest holes where priests would hide if someone had turned them in, and they could say, no, 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 we are Church of England, we are Anglican, we are not Catholic. And so the priest could be there and come out when necessary to have Mass with these sort of hidden Catholics. There were accusations of treason. There were threats that involved such coups as attempts to restore a Catholic like Mary Stuart to the English throne. And of course, beheadings, because she was beheaded for treason instead. And all this was finally resolved, at least somewhat, through the Protestantism of King James I of England. King James was Mary Stuart's son, and he ruled after the death of his cousin Elizabeth I. And he authorized in 1611 a translation of the Bible into English, and I still know people who won't read anything else. But I always like to point out that this version of the Bible, which many of us are familiar with, was translated during the same period during which Shakespeare wrote his most beautiful mature works, and that Bible has the same poetic cadence as Shakespeare does. William Blake says that the Bible is the great code of art. So what do you think? Was the partridge in a pear tree meant to represent Jesus Christ, the two turtle doves, the Old and New Testaments, the three French hens, the three virtues of faith, hope, and love, the four collie birds, four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Were the five golden rings symbolic of the first five books of the Old Testament, the six geese a-laying, the 6 days of creation before God's rest on the seventh day, the seven swans a-swimming, 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, the 8 maids a-milking, the 8 beatitudes, the 9 ladies dancing, the 9 fruits of the Holy Spirit, the 10 lords a-leaping, the 10 commandments, the 11 pipers piping, the 11 faithful disciples, excluding only Judas, who hanged himself in guilt? Were the 12 drummers drumming, the 12 points of belief in the Apostles' Creed, or the Nicene Creed, which is still spoken by the Methodists and the Catholics and the Episcopalians and the Lutherans and maybe some denominations I know nothing about? If not, it works out pretty neatly, does it, in terms of symbolism? So what does it all mean? Well, it means that in the Middle Ages, people liked good stories, they liked myths, and they liked sagas, just as we do today. And magic and strange supernatural occurrences never hurt one little bit. I hope you enjoy reading this poem as much as I